Greetings and welcome to Legacies of Wavryn, Lore of the Endelment. This will be chapter 25 of this reading. My brother revealed to me a terrible secret. I now understood who he truly was and what he became throughout his whole life. He was absolute darkness. Eyeless, father, and mother had kept a secret from everyone ever since my elder brother was born. Within his lifetime, Eyeless had learned to use darkness far better and more efficiently than anyone before him. He was even more superior than Shadow himself at the time. That both amazed and scared me. Growing up with the powers of darkness, Eyeless was able to mask everything about himself. His emotions, his powers, his strengths, and his voice. Even his most visible traits from the darkness form were unseen, unheard, and unknown. It was unbelievable, yet also frightening. Eyeless, now using his two-toned voice, said, "Now then, my dear little brother, if you can't even beat me in my simplest dark form in your basic state, then how am I expected to believe that you are the Endelment?" I stared at my brother in anger and replied, "What makes you think that I'm that ridiculous legend?" Eyeless chuckled at that, then replied, "Why don't you answer that by telling me, what's your special ability, little brother? Every person from Wavryn has one. Zaec could teleport. Salus could teleport. Mine was being granted darkness at birth. What's yours?" I gave a smirk as I raised my right hand up to my lower torso, with my middle finger and thumb pressing against each other, as I asked, "You really want to know?" My brother sighed at my motion and said, "You're pathetic." I snapped my fingers and whipped my right hand out from my side, while I said, "Break." Doing so caused time to slow down for me once again. However, not long after that, Eyeless used Dark Vanish to break free from my technique. He slowly shook his head, then asked, "What makes you think that you can use that ridiculous Time Breaker technique against me, little brother?" He then started walking around me as he continued, "Though you and I can talk normally, I have a far greater advantage at this point. Because, even though your technique can alter time to make seconds seem like hours, you forget that Dark Vanish can alter time to the point where it stands still." He then looked as if he was walking faster, but still taking slow strides, and continued, "Therefore, I can make myself move faster than you in this time shift." Eyeless shimmied over to stand in front of me, which looked as if he had just simply jolted over, and said, "You may know an ancient's technique and how to use it, but it's not special nor able to be used against me." With that, we removed ourselves from both techniques as I looked at Eyeless with an angry expression and said, "Anything else, elder brother? Because last I knew, you hate talking during a fight." After a few seconds of silence, my brother responded with, "There is. Something that led me to believe about you, brother." He then raised his right hand up to his medallion and said, "When you were born, I used my medallion on you. It not only reads emotions, but it can tell power levels as well, just by simply gently pressing it against the chest of the person where their heart is. I used it to see how it would react to you, even in your pitiful and defenseless state." Alice grabbed his medallion and raised it over his head to remove it from his neck, then held it out to me as he continued, "What I saw both impressed me and scared me." I glanced down at the medallion, then looked back up at Eyeless and asked, "What if I don't want to see it?" He gave a big grin as he chuckled and said, "Like father, you'll want proof no matter what it is. So sooner or later, you'll be begging to see it." consider this your one and only opportunity. I looked back down at the medallion as I slowly reached for it with my left hand, with those damn whispers rushing through my head again. However, I wasn't able to understand what they were trying to say. Yet once I grabbed the medallion, the whispers stopped. Eyeless lowered his hand and tightened it into a fist, glancing around to make sure that none of the remaining humans around us would interfere. I raised the medallion up to my chest, where my heart was, opening my hand slightly to see the center crystal. The crystal changed from Eyeless's emotions to mine, which was now a dark orange-yellow with small strips of forest green and navy blue lines that swirled around it. It indicated that I was slightly angry, with bits of my emotions that were still calm and caring rushing through my soul. After I examined it for a few seconds, I gently pressed the side of the medallion against my chest where my heart was. The crystal completely changed from what it was, showing one half being bright white and the other pitch black. They seemed as if fighting against each other for dominance. It also had a thin blood red line in between the two shades, acting like a lightning bolt, as it also shot quick bursts of lightning out into both shades. The crystal also had a brightly shining edge on the outside of it that was an opposite color on each shade. Once I saw that image, I was mesmerized for a few seconds. Then I quickly pulled it away from me, in fear when I heard the medallion make a light thunder noise. In my motion, I tossed the medallion aside and it shattered upon impact with the pavement. Eyeless glanced down at the broken pieces and said, "I still wanted that." The two of us then looked back up at each other as he asked, "Something wrong, little brother?" "So that's what you saw." "Exactly. The bloody lightning symbolizes you fighting between the black and the white, which symbolizes both the powers of darkness and illume. However, the negative edges indicate the usage of abyss and bliss on how to stop each power, I believe." I lowered my left hand and slightly placed it behind my back as I tightened my right hand into a fist. As I channeled energy into my left hand to call Galden back to me, I looked at Eyeless in anger and said, "So, you not only kept a secret about yourself from me, you also kept a secret about myself from me." "And," he asked, as he placed his left hand into his front pocket while removing his smile, "what of it?" "Oh, nothing." Galden quickly flew over into my left hand, then I moved it around to stab at my brother's head, so I yelled, "Just this!" Alice pulled his left hand out of his pocket to reveal a black, jagged-looking crystal, half a foot long and an inch thick. He moved the crystal in front of his belt buckle slightly and aimed it up. Before Galden could touch my brother, the crystal sprung up a centimeter-thick piece of itself that went about 3 inches higher than his head. The crystal quickly came into contact with my weapon, where it shattered the front half of Galden's blade into pieces without hassle. I was surprised at what happened, seeing how easily it was for that crystal to shatter the front end of my sword without any try. While I stood shocked, Eyeless said, "You still have much to learn, dear little brother." He then quickly swung the crystal out to his left side, trying to slice at my legs. Before the crystal could touch me, I jolted back and swung the broken half of Galden in my left hand to my left side, while I bent down to have my right hand grip the ground to stop myself from sliding back. Afterwards, I glanced over at the crystal, then at the shattered piece of Galden that broke off as I stood myself up. As I looked to the other broken half of Galden in my hand, Eyeless asked, "Did Rufus ever tell you what happened to his research here on this pathetic planet, brother?" I looked back up at him with a frightened expression again as he continued, "He had been working on how to use and alter the cassette crystal. But of course, he was a dumbass as always, and was going at his research all wrong." The crystal in my brother's hand reverted the spike back into itself as he continued, "He hadn't realized that because of a past study, never revealed to our worldly people, only someone from the Shero dynasty could alter the configurations of the material in cassette crystals. In fact, it was because of castatic crystals that the Shero family became the rulers of Boldor. Yet these crystals are still very hard to find, with them ending up getting obliterated along with their wielders. So you were the one that attacked Earth's lab 16 years ago. That's right. I released my grip on the broken half of Galden and stared at my brother in anger, while I said, "Guess that's bad news for you." Without any change in his expression, Alice said, "Gee, you're so funny." I pulled out Zane and Vince from their holsters and quickly aimed them at Eyeless. Before I could even put the slightest amount of pressure on the triggers, my brother raised and swung the crystal across his body to shoot out 2 small pieces of the weapon at my guns. Each single piece went straight into the barrels, ripping through into the revolvers to keep them from rotating. When I realized what he had done, the crystals exploded. They used only enough strength to break apart Zane and Vince into several pieces, getting me to quickly release the handles and tossing them aside as well. I also jolted back a couple feet from where I stood, surprised at how well my elder brother could thwart my attempt to attack. Eyeless moved his left hand back at his side and said, "I've always hated those pathetic toys of yours, Ryakin. You can never become what Jijiku once was, so don't bother trying. Now be a true Shero. Show me your real power." I stood myself up straight and gave a big grin as I started to snicker. Then after a few seconds it grew into a laugh as I raised my head up to look at the sky. As I laughed, I changed into my darkness form. I didn't want to use my Illume form because I wanted to prove my brother that I was stronger no matter what. So even with an equally powerful form, I was not going to let him win. I reached into my left coat pocket with my left hand to pull out the battered hilt of Rakar and swung it to my side. After a while, I stopped laughing as my arms hung straight down and I tilted my head slightly over to my left shoulder. Speaking in my two-toned voice, I said, "Very well then. I'm tired of playing games with you anyways, Dorgon." Eyeless gave me his angry glare and said, "How dare you dishonor darkness, Zaec?" "The name's Shattuck," I barked, and then channeled a small bit of my energy into Rakar to have it change into its dark broadsword form as I jolted towards Eyeless and yelled, "And you're dead!" Eyeless made the crystal spring out its blade again to try and block my assault, but just before I reached him, I used the Dark Vanish technique and motioned behind him, moving to swing across from my right. I struck his mid-torso at his right side and sent him through a large building, straight into a parked car on the other side. I vanished over to try and stab down at him, yet Eyeless vanished just before I could strike and grabbed the back of my coat's collar with his right hand. He threw me upward into the building that I slammed him through, where I crashed into the 10th floor, broke through the 11th, and hit the ceiling of the 12th floor, landing in an empty business cubicle. I quickly stood and sensed Eyeless flying up after me, then threw Rakar out the 12th floor's window in front of me. Just as he reached the 12th floor from outside, the sword stabbed my brother in his stomach. Before he started to fall, I jolted over and grabbed Rakar's hilt, while at the same time using Dark Vanish to send us somewhere in the middle of Egypt. I wanted a more secluded place from humans, so I figured scorching heat and endless desert would work. There, I slammed Eyeless into the ground and placed my left foot on his chest, ripping out Rakar and swinging it from my right across me to cut off half of his fox ears, just to make him feel more pain. I then stabbed the dark blade into his stomach again and leaned down as I charged a large amount of dark energy into my right hand. Viciously staring into his eyes, yet with an insanely happy grin on my face, I asked, "Any last words?" Eyeless laughed at that, then replied, "I'm just getting started." He went to stab my right shoulder with the crystal, but I quickly leaned my right side back to dodge the attack. However, he quickly raised his right hand up to aim it at me and shot out a body-sized energy blast. The attack threw me about 10 feet from him. It stunned me a bit, but after a few seconds I stood back up and shook some of the sand off me like an animal. My brother stood himself up straight and wiped away the blood that was dripping down the side of his mouth with his right hand, then vanished behind me just after I shook myself off. He roundhouse kicked me in the back left side of my head with his right foot, vanished over to me just as I hit a pyramid brick and tried again to stab me with the crystal. I barely dodged his attack by letting my body drop, having tried to pick myself up from the impact of his kick. The crystal narrowly missed me by an inch to the right side of my head. Eyeless gave me a smile and asked, "What's the matter, Zaec? Scared to get a little cut up?" I knew of those damn cassetic crystals. Like Galden, if used the right way, the weapon could easily kill any Kexon or Kexin with just the slightest cut, giving the victim a slow and painful death. It was worse than the Darkness tales. However, what really made the cassetic crystal dangerous was that it could change into anything that the user wanted it to be, and it could actually destroy anything that it struck, living or not. I looked over at the crystal to see where it had struck the brick that I hit, then watched Eyeless slowly pull the crystal out. He motioned to fly back from me about 15 feet, then I noticed the brick dissolve into itself from where it was stabbed by the crystal. It didn't take long for the brick to become absolutely nothing. Not even a speck of dust was left. I looked back at my brother as he started to laugh. Then he sarcastically said, "Oops, did I do that? Sorry." He then continued to laugh as he made the crystal shape itself to look just like Rakar, but it still had that crystal-like aspect to it. Once it formed, Eyeless said, "Well, brother, this is quite fun. However, even though you hold Rakar in your very hands, you cannot hope to defeat me with its worthless form. You're not using it with your true power. Its form is slow and weak, not even much of a real blade for that matter. Therefore, as long as you use it in that pathetic form, its true power." He vanished to move closer and looked down at me as he continued, "Will never be unleashed." Eyeless raised his blade up to swing it down with all his might, yet I quickly dodged it by jolting to my left side as I continued to face him. He smashed the brick that was once beneath me, then turned to me slowly as he angrily asked, "How dare you run from me, Rayakin?" I grew even angrier, yet decided to end this fight by changing into my Illum form. I quickly reached at my heart with my right hand and used my energy to calm my spirit, while jerking my hand slightly in a counterclockwise motion. In my new state, Rakar had to revert back into its hilt form, so I put it away and calmly said in my new dual tone, "I never run from a fight, Dorgon." He just smiled at my Illum form and said, "That's a good little bitch." Though I couldn't use the vanish technique, I did end up doing something more amazing to mind. I went out on a limb of hope and easily, for the first time, teleported. I used it first to motion towards my brother and punched him with my right fist into the center of his face. Then with the contact between us, I teleported us into a large abandoned farm area where it was heavily raining, sending Eyeless into an old and broken down barn. As he broke through the back of the barn, not even about to hit the ground, I teleported past him and kicked the back of his head with my right foot, then teleported again. With every teleportation, I struck once either by punching or kicking Eyeless around his body. After a few hits, I stopped to just stand and wait for my hits to take their effect. My brother hit the ground and quickly motioned to stand up, then tried to turn towards me to slice me from across his left with the crystal blade. However, he was halted by my delayed attacks, started to move from each strike where he stood. Once the moment passed, Eyeless took a few steps back from me, slightly gasping in pain. He then motioned to stand hunched over as he said, "Impressive, Zaec. Not even Zaec could pull off that much teleportation in one go. However, you're still weak and pathetic, even in your Illum form. He then changed the crystal in his hands back into its normal shape as he said, "You still lack strength, and your true speed is sluggish. In fact, it sickens me to think of you as a brother." The bastard still stands after all that beating? I thought. Impossible. Even for darkness. However, even with that, I grew a smirk as I said, "It's Zaec now. And why don't you be a good big brother and help me improve? Teach me. That is, if your moronic brain can even do so." Alice placed the crystal back into his left pants pocket as he looked at me with a very angry expression and said, "You'll regret those words, Zaec." He vanished over to try and punch me in the face with his left fist, but it was blocked by my right hand with ease. I teleported again to straight kick him in the face with my left foot, and teleported to jump and spin kick a random side of his head with my left foot again. I placed my feet down and turned my back to my brother, with him being thrown into the abandoned house that was on the farm far off. Shortly after he hit, I sensed him struggling to get back onto his feet. I turned to look over my left shoulder to find he had 2 more black foxtails grow from him, along with his entire body healed from its battle scars. He also grew another spike on the outer edge center of his right forearm, and a spike on the right side of his forehead. The 2 of us jolted towards each other, meeting just outside the area of the house with our right fists pulled back for a punch. However, as I swung, he first vanished to get his hit on the left side of my face, then vanished again to use the technique on both of us. For some reason, we appeared in Los Angeles, California. We were right in the center of a 4-way crossroad, where I was thrown into an oncoming car to my right that didn't have any time to stop before it struck me. However, it was able to stop before it could run me over, halting traffic from all directions. I got on all 4s and shook myself off like an animal again, then stood up and brushed myself to act as if what happened was nothing. "Now things are getting interesting," I said. I then turned around to face Alice, who was simply standing at the end of the crossroad waiting for me, and I asked, "Got any more tricks up your sleeves?" With that, I laughed a bit as I moved my head back for a second, then placed my hands at my hips and continued, "Oh, that's right. You don't have sleeves." Alice glared at me as he said, "You're an idiot, Rayakin." He jolted towards me to punch me again, but I dodged his attack by leaning down slightly. I also tried to counter with my right fist into his stomach. Of course, he dodged my attack. Afterwards, we just struck one another rapidly, dodging and blocking each other's attacks, trying to outmatch each other in speed. Our movements picked up to the speed of sound with each attack. Then we slammed our fists against each other's and put ourselves in a deadlock. The impact caused a small sonic boom, with a shock wave that was strong enough to slightly move some of the cars nearby and set off their alarms. At that point, all of the humans that were around, either on the sidewalk or in their cars, moved to watch the fight between my elder brother and I. I tried to kick Eyeless in the left side of his head with my right foot, but he ducked and jumped back a foot. When I missed, I spun around and placed my foot back down on the ground. I got myself to face my brother again, then gave a smirk and sarcastically said, "What's the matter, dear elder brother? Afraid to get a little bashed up?" As I laughed at that, Eyeless reached back into his left pocket as he barked, "Shut your mouth, Zaec." He then pulled out the castetic crystal again and placed it in his right hand as he grew 2 more black foxtails, along with a small spike on the top of his right wrist and on each of his knuckles. With that, he said, "So I slightly underestimated you, little brother. But now, you better start fighting for real." He shaped the crystal to look like a long yet simple looking katana, which still had that crystal look to it. Then he continued, "Or else you might just get hurt." Ooh, I'm so scared. I then pulled Ricard back out into my left hand and formed it back into its giant broadsword form. However, when I did, I accidentally changed back into my Shattuck state. I glanced at myself and asked, how the hell? Eyeless laughed and said, "Idiot. You can't expect to wield Rakar and Enzar in your Illum form, nor even in your original form. Darkness won't allow it." I turned back to my brother in anger, readying myself against him, and said, "Doesn't matter. I can still beat you. We'll see." We stared off for a few seconds, then used Dark Vanish and ended up somehow still being able to move normal with one another. We jolted towards each other and clashed blades as hard as we could, the loud sounds of metal clanking as both blades met one another in each of our swings. We slashed at each other as fast as we could. Then I took one last swing by spinning around from my right and swung Rakar across to my left. At the same time, Eyeless raised his blade over his head and behind him with both hands, then swung down at me to counter. We clashed one last time and somehow broke away the Vanish state, while pushing each other back about 3 feet. The last clash was actually so great from our impact that it sent out another sonic boom. It was powerful enough to shatter all the glass-like objects within a quarter-mile radius of Eyeless and me. The humans around us jumped in surprise of what happened, and some screamed from it, while others looked around confused and tried to figure out what really happened. Eyeless and I jolted back from one another, only to jolt at each other and start clashing again, with each clash slashing a small scar into the ground in between us. A few seconds passed, and things got a bit slow for us from draining our energy, which made things a little more difficult. When we started to slow down, I swung Rakar across my chest from left to right at Eyeless. However, he dodged it by jumping over the blade as it swung by. He quickly moved to stab me in my upper torso as he placed his feet down, but I dodged his attack by leaning back and to my right quite a bit. When I dodged, I motioned Rakar back to my left to try and strike him again. He evaded it by ducking down as he pulled his blade away from me. In the motion of my swing, I raised Rakar up and over my head to swing down at my brother. He used his blade to quickly push himself away from me, where he just barely missed from being hit by my blade. Having avoided my attack, he just stood about 7 feet away from me as we stared off again, while Rakar's blade slammed into the ground about half a foot deep. I jerked Rakar out of the ground and held it down at my right side. I began to sinisterly chuckle, and after a few seconds it became a loud laugh. I was hardly impressed with the way Eyeless was fighting. It was a joke. In some ways it insulted me, because he wasn't proving himself to me the way I thought he would. So fighting at his level was all I could do to have some fun at that point, along with insulting him. I didn't want to kill him quick. It just wasn't sportsmanlike to me. I wanted to get in a good standoff before I sent his soul deep into Abyss itself. While I laughed, Eyeless stood up and moved his blade to his right side as he looked at me with a very angry expression and said, "So that's it then. You're not fighting me at all, are you? You've been faking it this whole time." I calmed down as I looked at him in anger and said, "It's about time your minuscule brain figured it all out. You thought that just because you had darkness your whole life that it meant you were the best at handling it. You also thought that you were stronger than everyone else when it came to using it. Well, you're..." I quickly raised my voice and shouted, "Wrong!" I lowered my voice back down and continued, "Like you said before, brother, I am the Endelment, which means I will always have the advantage in this fight no matter what." I then took a step closer with my left foot towards Eyeless as I yelled, "That's right! No matter what happens, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, you'll never beat me." I then raised my voice a bit more in a vicious tone and shouted, "I've won!" Eyeless's expression calmed as he stared at me for a few seconds in silence. Then he gave a big sigh as he reverted the crystal back into its normal form again. He tossed it over at my feet and said, "You're right, brother. You win." I looked at him, confused, as I stood myself up straight and lowered Ricard to where the tip hit the ground. Then I looked down as I knelt to pick up the crystal with my left hand. I placed the crystal into my pants pocket as I looked back at Eyeless with an angry expression and said, "I'll be leaving then, brother, seeing as you can no longer fight me." "You're right," Eyeless said again. With that, I once again looked at him confused as he continued, "You're right, brother. You win. That is, if you think that what you have is pure darkness, abyss itself." He then turned to his left to have his right side aimed at me, where the spikes on his arm could face me. He grew his last 4 black foxtails as the spikes continued to grow bigger, longer, and slightly curled upward. He turned his head towards me, looking over his shoulder, and said, "Watch very closely, Zaec." Alice's 9 tails stretched out from him, then they twirled around each other and verted back into his body. When his tails reverted, he grew a small spike on his right side collarbone, as the spike on his right shoulder grew bigger and straight out at an angle, along with 4 other spikes on his back, 2 at his upper back and the other 2 at his lower back. The spikes on his right arm grew out to about 4 inches from his arm and curled up slightly, while the spikes themselves split apart an inch from the tip. His entire right arm's skin changed into scales, nearly reaching halfway up the right side of his neck and halfway over the right side of his upper torso. The scales were pitch black as well, but would shine dark blue in certain angles. His nails in his right hand grew to be inch-long claws, with the spikes on his knuckles growing a small bit out as they curled out like his claws. His fox ears reverted into his head as his normal ears grew back on the sides. The spike on his head grew out and curled back slightly, with another spike that grew on the other side of his forehead that looked the same. Last, his eyes went completely black, the pupils dark blue as they dilated like snake eyes, while his entire body grew 4 inches, both length and width. Eyeless turned back to face me, while he spoke in a very dark and vicious tone of his former voice, and said, "There you have it, Zaec. My true form. My full power. Abyss." Every time Eyeless took a breath, his snake-like tongue would lash out about 3 inches from his mouth. I stood quietly and stared at him for a few seconds, surprised at his transformation. Then I broke out laughing hysterically. As I laughed, my brother said, "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Zaec. You will anger me." With that, I just laughed even harder, shutting my eyes tight and nearly dropping Ricard out of my right hand. After about 10 seconds, I calmed down a bit and regained my grip on Ricard while I opened my eyes. I noticed Eyeless was standing directly in front of me as he stared down at me with a blank yet angry glare. I jumped slightly, surprised to see him, and said, "Whoa, how'd you do that?" Instead of answering with words, my brother swung his right fist and punched me in the left side of my face so fast I didn't even have time to use Dark Vanish to counter it. His punch had so much force that it ripped my head halfway off my neck and shattered my lower jaw on impact, yet it didn't move me anywhere from where I was standing. It took me about a minute to recover from his strike, and even then I was still in pain. I tried to swing down at Eyeless with Ricard as hard as I could, but he stopped my attack by simply grabbing the blade with just his right before it could hit his shoulder. Let's see how well you handle Ricard without the help of darkness to configure its form for you. My brother clenched his right hand into a fist and broke the blade of Ricard. Then the broken bits became dark energy that had previously been put into the hilt, which Eyeless absorbed into himself with his right hand. Ricard changed back into its battered hilt form. Then Eyeless lowered his right hand and said, "Now prove yourself, Endelment." I looked at my brother in fear for a moment, then looked down at the hilt of Ricard as I raised it up slightly. I tried to channel my dark energy into it, but nothing happened. After a few seconds, I realized that I had the crystal that I could use, so I motioned for it with my left hand. Eyeless raised his right hand up at my left arm and quickly charged a great amount of his dark blue energy into it, shooting it to halt me just as I got an inch to my left pocket. The blast struck my arm hard enough to throw the left side of my body back and paralyze my left arm to keep me from using it. I gave out a quick scream of pain as I moved to hold my left shoulder with my right hand. Then Eyeless said, "Don't be a coward, Endelment. Don't be like father. Prove yourself." He then lowered his right hand as he continued, "Bring forth Rakarn Enzar's true power." Just then, 2 gunshots went off and Eyeless was hit in his left shoulder and upper left arm. We looked over to see a policeman aiming his pistol at my brother, who stood far out from the crossroad trying to stop him. Eyeless stepped closer with his left foot towards the policeman to try and scare him. And when that did nothing, he turned to face the human completely. I looked up at my brother and angrily said, "Leave them alone, Dorgon. They're not worth it." He just ignored me and took 2 steps closer to the policeman, who shot 3 more times. However, that didn't have any effect. And then yelled, "Get back here, you coward! I'm not finished!" "You are to me," Eyeless said as he kept his focus on the policeman. The policeman shot 1 last time, then Eyeless jolted towards him. I bolted after my brother and shouted, "Enough!" I stabbed him in the back of his heart with Rakar, the weapon sideways, which had finally taken its new form. Rakar had changed into a special looking katana that had a foot long and an 1.5 inch thick hilt. It had 2 blades attached to the hilt that were both 5 feet long, 1/4 inch thick, and 1 inch wide, that were pitch black with a thin blood red line going through the center of them from the hilt to the tips. The entire sharpened edge of the blades were very small, sharp teeth, all angled back towards the hilt and were nearly impossible to see with the naked eye. The hilt was covered with a golden cloth and had a white satin ribbon wrapped around it, making a diamond design along the hilt. At the bottom of the hilt, it had an 1 inch thick, round, blood red chain that came out and was as long as the entire sword itself, with a small dark silver metal spike attached to the end of the chain. The chain would wrap itself around the arm of the wielder where they held the hilt, locking itself in place at the top of the wielder's forearm. However, once the wielder started either swinging the sword wildly, or if the wielder felt the need to use the chain and spike, it would break away for that moment. Unaffected by the newly formed weapon having stabbed him, Eyeless looked down at the blades that were sticking out and quietly said, "Rakarn Enzar. It really is beautiful." I then ripped Rakar from him, swinging the blades out to the right side and slicing off his right arm. Eyeless turned back to me as he chuckled, unaffected by what I did, and he said, "Finally, you've let Rakarn Enzar have a taste of your true power." "What do you mean?" I said in anger as I swung the blades down at my right side. "All I did was get pissed." "Exactly," he said as his right arm healed back. "As the Endelment, your emotions dictate your flow of power and how it's used. Rakarn fed off the massive amount of dark energy in your hateful emotion that you used when you wanted to stop me. Therefore, you brought forth Rakarn Enzar's true form by using your true powers. No one else that Rakarn Enzar allows to wield it can bring forth its real nature, because they can't channel their energy purely through their emotions as you can." Alice's arm healed back completely as he raised his hand up slightly and cracked his knuckles a bit, then continued, "Good thing I was already using my abyss form before you reconfigured that dark blade. Otherwise, I might have been dead right then and there." I looked down at Rakar, depressed, and said, "But I thought Rakar had a white blade." and that it was just tainted by shadow all this time. I thought it was the shining sword of bliss. I saw JJ use it. Ilis laughed as he lowered his hand, then said, "You still believe those dumb tales of the apocalyptic blades, brother? Well, even so, they're wrong. Whatever you saw Jericho do was a deception that Rakaran Enzar used to keep itself hidden. Rakaran Enzar is really the vile sword that everyone fears. Rumors are just that. Rumors. False ideals. The facts for Rakaran Enzar and Rokadrek Gaken were mixed up. Rakaran Enzar is a beautiful tool of destruction and chaos. The dark blade of abyss." I looked up at my brother in anger and tightened my grip on Rakar, then quickly pulled the sword back and swung it down at Ilis. However, he somehow disappeared by quickly forming into a black cloud of himself. Even before Rakar could hit that, the cloud quickly dropped to the ground and disappeared into the shadows around me. As I completed my swing, nearly slamming the blades into the pavement, my brother said, "Well, Endelment, I thought you said you had won this fight. So come on." I looked around for Ilis as I raised Rakar in my defensive position. Then there came a weird separate laughter of my brother's voice that sounded as if it was coming in from a distance. With the laughter continuing, Ilis said, "Come on, brother. Don't you know where I am? Can't you find me? You sounded so confident when you had the advantage previously in our fight. Now you're just a frightened and pathetic loser." I lowered Rakar as I continued to look around and yelled, "Where are you, Dorgon? Show yourself, you coward!" The laughing grew louder as he said, "Each morning I appear to lie at your feet. All day I will follow, no matter how fast you run, yet I nearly perish in the midday sun." I continued to look around as I tried to understand what my brother had said, and when I walked into the very center of the crosswalk I realized it. Ilis had spoken in a riddle, one that I had never heard before. While looking at everything around me, the laughter changed into the riddle and continued to play it over and over and over again, endlessly. After a while, I looked up at the sky and yelled, "Enough! I can't take it anymore!" I then dropped Rakar at my feet to raise both of my hands up to cover my fox ears tight and said, "Stop it! Just stop it! I can't take it!" I then dropped to my knees as I looked up at the sky again and shouted, "Stop it!" The voices grew louder as some of them started to laugh again, while others barked insults as loud as they could, nearly drowning out the other voices. As I lowered my head, I looked out in front of me to see a simple human. The human was leaning to the left slightly into their car, and appeared to me that they were trying to signal something, flashing the headlights at me. I didn't think they could hear my brother too, but they seemed calm about his words. I released the pressure on my ears as I continued to stare at their headlights, confused. Then after a few seconds I finally realized it. I knew where Ilis was, and how to defeat him. I picked up Rakar again and held the handle with both of my hands, then turned the sword around to have the blades aimed down just as the person stopped flashing their lights at me. At the same time, all the humans around me with their cars went to turn their lights on, with both their high and low beams shining. I looked down to see my shadow trying to move away from under me. Ilis was trying to escape. When I noticed my brother struggling to break free, his multiple speeches stopped as one last voice begged to be set free. Looking at the shadow, I yelled, "Now who's weak, brother? You're nothing but a fake image of my former self. My own damn shadow." I raised Rakar up a bit more, then moved to thrust the dual blades down with all my might. I stabbed the sword halfway into the ground where Ilis was, revealing his true body on the ground, the Rakar stabbed through his heart. With my brother lying on his back on the ground, I jammed Rakar deeper to keep him from moving any further. I then released my grip on Rakar and stood up as I looked down at Eyeless in anger. I raised my right hand to my heart again and pulled away Shadow's soul from me, changing into Zaec once more as I became calm. As I held Shadow's soul in my right hand, Eyeless fearfully looked up at me as he said, "Brother, please, don't kill me." I slammed my right hand onto the bottom of Rakar's hilt to fuse Shadow's soul with the sword. Then I slowly moved my right hand down and grabbed the center of the hilt as I calmly asked, "Who said I was going to kill you?" I gripped the handle harder and Rakar changed its shape again. However, it became a much darker and more brutal form. The chain attached to the bottom of the hilt quickly swung itself off my arm and struck through Eyeless. It also broke through the ground and moved to have the spike of the chain wrap around the tips of the dual blades. The hilt broke away from the blades and fused into the chain. Then the entire sword started to take its true and more vile form. The hilt grew over the chain while still being 1.5 inches thick around, and it stretched to be 5 feet long. The hilt also changed to be completely metal, which was dented, scratched, and rusted up a bit, and was mainly colored black with a blood red shine. The dual blades fused into one and stretched to have each tip slightly over each end of the hilt. The newly created pitch black weapon had the ability to change into anything that had a blade-like quality to it, along with it being 1 foot wide and 1 centimeter thick in the center that thinned out when it reached to connect the tips at each end of the hilt. The blade curved over the hilt as each tip connected with it, where the middle of the blade was bowed out 1/2 foot away from the handle. When Rakar changed again, it ripped Eyeless's heart in half and made him spit up about 2 pints of blood. I quickly pulled the blade out from him and swung it away from my right side to whip his blood off it, watching him struggle to even rejuvenate as I said, "It's over. There's no point in fighting you anymore. I've won." I then turned myself from my brother as I placed Rakar on my back and walked away. Eyeless slowly stood up on his feet and said, "No, not yet. I'm not finished." "You are to me." "Zaec!" In spite to see what he wanted, I turned to face my brother again and saw him slam his right fist into the ground to use Dark Rise. One spike only came up at me at first, which I stepped back to avoid. However, others formed and I started blocking each one that came up afterwards, swiftly swinging Rakar against them. Every time I swung to break a spike, I used a different form of Rakar's new state, just for the fun of it. Though I knew what I was doing and was completely calm fighting against Eyeless, mentally, I was very much amazed at what Rakar could do in its fully powered form, especially since I was using it in my illumined state. Apparently, since it was shaped from my energy, along with added power from Shadow's soul, it wouldn't reject me in any of my forms or transformations. Rakar's true state had over 100 different types of blade forms in which to use. Most were only handheld. However, the fun ones were the ones that you could either let swing freely by a chain or that you could only use by levitating them. And I didn't understand why it took a god's soul to release its true form, or for that matter, my own. After jumping back about 30 feet, having used nearly all of the different forms of Rakar, I just raised his right fist up and swung it back down at the ground to strike up 9 spikes at me at the same time. However, all 9 spikes were blocked by Bright Shine with ease. With that, I formed Rakar back into its one bow blade state and swung it with my right hand over my right shoulder to hang it on my back. Eyeless jolted over to me with his right hand stretched out, yet before I could stop him, he grabbed my right arm with his right hand and dug his claws into my upper arm, making me scream in pain as I tried to remove his hand with my left hand. In my struggle, I couldn't grasp the thought to gain hold of Ricard to use it against him. I just panicked out of control from how much pain I was going through and couldn't try to fight back. I just wanted to get away. As I struggled to remove his grasp, Eyeless looked straight into my eyes and said, "Next time we meet, dear little brother, I won't hold back." He then ripped his claws away by pulling them down and quickly struck the right side of my face with the back of his right fist, knocking me unconscious instantly. I had no idea at the time what Eyeless had done to me or why he let me live. For that matter, why he wanted me to use Ricard's true form. Whatever it was, it didn't really bother me none. All I knew was that I had a new toy, as any of my brothers would say. And like a child, I wanted to play with it. And with my new powers, now that I felt I could finally do damage to my brother, who was already better than Dominic. That said, I also wanted to finally have Father show his god-awful face to me on Earth, only so that I could put either my knuckles or my boot into it. I've always wanted to fix it up like that. Might actually be pretty for once. This concludes the reading of Chapter 25. Thank you all for watching and listening. If you like what you've seen and heard, there will be a link to my physical works in the description below. With that being said, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you again next week reading Chapter 26.